Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Plus, you uncovered quite an interesting story regarding the bones.
Yes, and that's yes. Let me tell, because that really is an interesting story. And I'm still, actually, as recently as a week ago, I was working on that. So we are digging underneath Nebi Daniel Mosque, which is where Hella and George and others placed the tomb of Alexandra, which was called Alexander, which is called the Soma, and. In the middle of this is 1979, the students in Tehran took over the American embassy, and suddenly there was a huge crisis between the Islamic world and the United States. And the director of mosques in Egypt came down from Cairo and said to me, "We don't want an incident. We're not going to be able to let you continue to excavate." Everything we had found up to that point, we're underneath in the crypt, underneath Nebi Daniel, which had originally been a Christian church, and before that had been a classical world temple. Anyway, we're down in his crypt, about 20 feet down, 30 feet, and he says, "We can't continue, we're afraid of an incident." So we stopped, and we're driving away from the tomb, and I'm feeling very dejected and really unhappy, and because we've been thwarted and we were just on the edge of it. And George says to me, "Well, don't worry, Stephen, the bones aren't there anyway." And I said, "What do you mean the bones aren't there?" And he said, "Oh, well, the bones were taken away years ago, many years later." I said, "How are they taken away?" And he said, "Well, you know, before they gave the city over to the Muslims, a group of monks came down masquerading as merchants, and they gathered up all the bones that were underneath the mosque, what is now the mosque.
Which was then a church, I guess.
Which was then a church. And they put them all, because they thought it was John the Baptist is associated with Alexandria, they put all the bones in leather bags and tied them on the back of donkeys and took them up to a monastery that's up in the desert. I didn't know what he was talking about. And I said, "Well, that's an amazing story, George, but even if I found, this is pre-DNA, even if I found the bones, how would I know which bones there were?" He said, oh, it's simple. I can tell you exactly. When Mark Antony was in Alexandria with Cleopatra, he had the crystal coffin opened. Now, I need to say, when Ptolemy Soter took over the city of Alexandria, he bribed the funeral cortege, which was bringing the body of Alexander back.
He died in Babylon, as I recall.
Yes, that's right. He died in Babylon. And it was this big cortege was coming back, and he apparently bribed them, and they brought the bones to Alexandria because Soter understood that whoever controlled the body would get the authenticity, the authority that would transfer from Alexander to. So while the other generals were all fighting over how to break up the empire, he just said, "I'll just take Egypt," and then he got the bones. And he, at the crossroads of the two main streets in the city of Alexandria, he built this big temple, or this big tomb, sort of like, in fact, specifically, Stalin got this idea from Ptolemy Soter, because when he was a seminarian, he had learned this. He built this big tomb in the middle of the crossroads of the biggest cities, and he put the bones there, and that just as Stalin controlled Lenin's body, he controlled Alexander's body. And then subsequently, another Soter took it out of the coffin that it was in and put it in a crystal coffin, which is, again, just like Lenin. And so people could come through and see the body. It was preserved. And so George says, Oh, well, you know, he had them open up the crystal coffin, and he took off his red Roman war cape and had it put around the body so that he would then be considered an associate. The power would be conferred from
Alexander is wearing his mantle.
That's right, exactly. And he said, but you know, after the Christians took over the city, they didn't care about any of that, so they didn't maintain it properly, and water seeped in, and the dye from the war cape stained the bones. So what you're looking for are red-stained bones.
How detailed and specific.
Yes, okay, I think that's a wonderful story, but you know, what are you going to do with it? And about 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a call from NBC, and they said, there is a monastery up in the desert in Egypt who think they have found the bones of John the Baptist. Would you go up and you've got the only archaeologically sensitive film crew in Egypt. Would you go up? We'll contract with you. Would you go up and film it? So we went up to what the area is called Wadi Natrun, to the monastery of San Makarios, the oldest Christian monastery in Egypt, and we got up to this monastery. And it looks like a fortress. It has just one little door. We knocked on the door, and the monk came out, and we went in, and I talked to the prior, Father John, and who's now the abbot, and I said to him, you know, what's going on? And we were repairing a wall in a chapel that we associate with John the Baptist, and in repairing the wall, we discovered a tomb. I said, well, what's in the tomb? And he said, well, there's a bunch of bones. And I said, that's very interesting. So we went in and filmed this and took pictures. And I said to him, do you have any idea where these bones came from? He said, oh, yes, we know exactly where they came from. And I said, where? And he said, oh, they come from underneath the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. And I said, oh, yes? And he said, yes. When the city was turned over to the Muslims in 641 AD, a group of the brothers went down masquerading as merchants, and they gathered up all the bones because we believe the bones of John the Baptist were there, and we put them in leather bags, and they tied them on the back of donkeys, and they brought them up to the monastery, and we thought that they had simply been lost. We didn't know where they buried them until we were repairing the wall and we found this tomb. I go, oh my goodness. And I said, well, is there anything about these bones that's unusual? And so he thinks for a minute and he says, well, no, it's bones of about 14 people, long bones mostly. Well, a few of them are stained red. They have this reddish stain on them and we don't know what it is.